in a way, I think that our current policy posture reminds me in some uncomfortable ways of American policy towards Iraq after the Kuwait War. Right? If you remember, sanctions were placed on Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait. After Iraq was forced to withdraw from Kuwait, those sanctions were not lifted. And they were not lifted on the argument that that Iraq was not fully into compliance with UN resolutions. What, to my memory, and I'm happy to be proven wrong here, what no administration that I remember ever saying was that if Iraq ever did come into full compliance, they would be lifted. In a sense, the U.S. government, after some dithering, by the middle of the Clinton administration, had embarked on a clear policy of regime change in Iraq, and sanctions was sort of a part of that. If you're going down that road, it doesn't make any sense to lift sanctions. And we got ourselves into, in a sense, an unworkable position, especially as the sanctions began to disintegrate towards the end of the decade. You even take 9/11 out of it, and American policy is in a little bit of a cul-de-sac over Iraq. In a sense where, and I can't remember who said this, sanctions are always ratcheted up. You never hear talk of ratcheting down sanctions. Once you go down the road of essentially saying only essential foodstuffs and medicine and material that has absolutely no military uses whatsoever can go in and out of Gaza. And on the list of military material are things like concrete and paper. If you go down that road, what you're essentially doing is deliberately engineering, I'm sorry to quote myself here, but deliberately engineering economic collapse in Gaza. That has been done. Then stepping in with enough food to make sure, and medicine to make sure that nobody starves. There may be malnutrition, but nobody's going to starve. And no political way to dig your way out. And that's, in a sense, I think where our policy is right now. Essentially, a cul-de-sac where we can find no alternative to the policy, and therefore, but it's also, I should add, a policy that has no real cost to the United States, and therefore is one that will probably continue until it completely breaks down. And the Obama administration, I think, when it came in, looked at the possibility of revising this policy in some way for about 30 seconds or so, and essentially has decided to stick with it, on the assumption that the reason why you didn't get an agreement in the past was because the Bush administration was stupid and didn't pursue it seriously and didn't pursue it in the right ways. The Bush administration may have been stupid. It may have not pursued it in the right ways. But it seems to me in 2010, the option of going back to the period and doing what the Bush administration should have done earlier is just not a viable option. But that's where our policy is. Are there alternatives? Well, this is where I'm supposed to get constructive, and I can't really, because yes, there are alternatives, but they're all riskier, and I don't advance them with any great degree of enthusiasm. A year ago, I wrote that the Bush administration had squandered the previous ceasefire. A year ago, in the midst of the Gaza conflict, I said, look, you had a year-long ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, and the Bush administration squandered this on meaningless diplomacy. The Obama administration has essentially done the same thing. It's been a year of quiet largely quiet between Israel and Gaza, and that has been squandered on essentially figuring out what the policy is and then implementing a policy that I think is based on diplomatic realities that are no longer extant. So the alternative that I would offer would be one that starts not with the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli conflict that we would like to see, but the one that actually exists right now, and that works on making that more livable and more viable. It's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that exists right now. This is one with a Palestinian split. It is one in which Hamas is deeply entrenched in Gaza, and in which, interestingly, Hamas now has something to lose. They have a stake. which in a sense they didn't if you go back to the 1990s. They are a governing authority in Gaza and would like to maintain that. Not necessarily forever, but the interesting thing is, if on a couple of occasions I've had the opportunity to ask people sort of close to or in the movement, okay, you don't want Gaza forever. What's your long-term plan? And the answer that I got was my favorite, was, American power won't always be what it will be. China's a rising power, and God will provide. I mean, it's a great answer for an Islamist movement. The dependence on God and the dependence on China. I don't know how those two factor together, but in a sense, behind that, I think, is not so much a strategy as a mentality. And the mentality is something like this. Again, tomorrow's another day. God will provide, and what we can see right now is making our current predicament work or more workable. If you look at this from the perspective of Hamas, and you look at where they are in 2010, and you compare this to where they are where they were founded in the movement, they look like they're doing pretty well. So yes, there are all sorts of problems. But overall, this is not a steady upward curve for the movement, but essentially this mentality that is one that has served them well, kind of fixing on the perhaps on a distant dream, but making very practical day-to-day decisions, and those practical day-to-day decisions again go right back to making Gaza work. And starting policy on that basis, on coming up with some sort of workable arrangements, not simply for the governments involved, but probably for the people involved. And then perhaps taking a little bit of this attitude, figuring that an investment in stability is one that can be built on as a later date. This isn't a very powerful argument to make, but I think it's the only viable one that I can think of. So in essence, it's an argument for deferring conflict-ending diplomacy for now. It's an argument for working on making viable arrangements, and it's an argument for sucking Hamas into a political and diplomatic process in the hope that at some later point, they'll be a little bit easier for the international system and for their adversaries to digest. Thank you.